All right, let me go over again what we're trying to do in this class. We are hoping to tell a little bit of our story as a church and as a city, and both as the Episcopal Church and Christ Church, as we talk about issues of race. Trying to kind of build building blocks as we kind of engage in the process for what we as a community can do to bring about true equality and fight racism in all its forms. So the first class I had last week, we talked about the history of race in Pensacola, and the wonderful Tiniade Broughton joined me, and she was fascinating and riveting, and we had a great conversation. I want to introduce, my name is Michael Hoffman. Some people call me Father Michael. I am the rector of Christ Church. I'm joined today with a man, this is in no order. This is some things I know about Freddie. He is a Marine, a pastor, a teacher. He is a father, a husband, and a grandfather. And I'm lucky enough to also call him my friend. He is a leader in this community, and Pensacola is blessed that Pastor Tellis is here in this community. Freddie, how you want to do this, Freddie? You want to go with Pastor Tellis and Pastor Hoffman, or you want to go Michael and Freddie?
Michael and Freddie is fine.
All right, good. That's how we normally talk to each other. So then, do you want to introduce yourself? Tell the group a little bit more about yourself.
Okay. 30 years Marine Corps. 48 years married to my bride. 3 children, 10 grandchildren, 12 great grandchildren. Love the Lord, and I am privileged and humbled to call Michael Hoffman my friend. And we've kind of become, I think, more than just friends in that sense. So he's a trusted friend and colleague, and so I guess that's really about it. I guess that's a lot, but that's about it. That's me.
Thank you. I mainly brought Freddie on so he'd say nice things about me, is really why he is here. I forgot to say, Freddie is the head pastor at Allen AME Church, Allen Chapel AME Church, which is a historic church, much like Christ Church is in our community. All right, so let's start the class. The Episcopal Church of the United States is 90% white, and it's 4% black. You sometimes will hear Sunday morning called the most segregated hour in America. Whites go to predominantly white churches. Normally blacks go to predominantly black churches. And I've always kind of considered or thought that was because of our culture and history and norms and what happened. But I've been kind of doing some research, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about maybe why. Why is the Episcopal Church predominantly and overwhelmingly white? And a little bit more about that history. Now, I need to be honest about something, everybody out there. Last week, we talked about the history of race in Pensacola, and when I wrote my dissertation, I did a ton of research on that. So I was much more prepared for that class than I am for this one. I'm relying a lot on this class, on a lot of resources the Episcopal Church has put together to tell our story about race better. And one book in particular, it's called Episcopalians and Race, Civil War to Civil Rights by Gardner Shattuck. I recommend that if anybody who likes history and wants to know more about this stuff. We'll get to Freddie in a moment, but a little bit of background. The Episcopal Church is, as many of you know, part of the Church of England. So to tell our story a little bit, I'm going to do this part in like 2 minutes. The Church of England grew to wherever the English Empire went. So they started up churches around the world. The Anglican Church, which is another way to say the Church of England, is the second largest group of Christians in the world behind the Catholics. And there are more Black Anglicans than any other race. In fact, there are more Anglicans in the continent of Africa than the rest of the world combined. But the Church of England's history on this is a little bit more complicated. it was based on colonialism. It was white people going in, subjugating other races, and setting up their system of understanding of government and church on top of those places. And also, we should say, again, briefly, but I think we always need to acknowledge, made rich by those territories and colonies, including the slave trade. There are churches in England that were built by families who made their money from the slave trade. So they, within England, there was this, the church oftentimes enabled that practice and systemic racism in all kinds of different ways. But they were also a part of the making it better, both from people from Africa who came to England. And in England, it was easier to be a free Black with a voice than it was in America. So, for example, there was a guy, and I'm going to butcher his name, but there was a guy named Ulada Equina. He was a slave. He was enslaved as a child in Ghana. He went to, the person that his owner was on a Navy ship. He traveled around the world. He became educated along that process. He eventually bought his freedom, ended up in England, and he became a predominant voice for the horrors of the slave trade and began to speak at churches around England as a layperson, but as a devout believer in God, that what was happening was wrong. One of the men that he spoke to one time is one of my personal spiritual heroes. So like there are people who were Black in England calling for change, but there were also people that were white that were calling for change. There's a guy, one of my spiritual heroes is a guy named William Wilberforce. He was in Parliament and he had a conversion experience. And he was mentored when he had this conversion experience by a man named John Newton, who you all will know as the man who wrote Amazing Grace, the great hymn. And he decided that slavery was an affront to God. And he began, they called him the moral conscience of England. Every time he spoke at Parliament, he called for the end of the slave trade. The first time he put forward a bill, it was voted down like 98% against, and then him and two friends or whatever it was for. But for 40 years, he kept putting forward laws and bills trying to end the slave trade. He would bring forward people like Ulada Equina to speak before Parliament. And when he died, a month later, Parliament ended slavery in all its forms in all of its colonies and territories. They say that on that one day, 1 million people were freed. Think about that number for a second. 1 million people were freed. Unfortunately, though, that happened in 1833. Not unfortunately, but unfortunately for the slave practice in America, it happened after the American Revolutionary War. So was there no slavery in Canada? Because that law was passed in 1833. In the Revolutionary War, and this is really what I want to kind of talk about, and Freddie and we'll dig into this a little bit. After the American Revolution in America, the Episcopal Church was what it became known as, the Church of England in America after the Revolutionary War. There was, through the Revolutionary War, there were many slaves who were freed during that process. And so there became in northern cities these pockets of freed Black men and women. And there were two in particular that were like best friends, good colleagues. Like Freddie and I, he said a minute ago, we're more than friends, we're colleagues. We work together in this work. They were like that, except they were both Black. One, I'm going to tell you about one, and then Freddie's going to tell you about the other. Absalom Jones was the first Episcopal priest who was Black. He had been a part of the Methodist Church, and this was before the Methodists split away from us, so there was really just the Methodist Church inside the Episcopal Church. It was actually him and Allen, who Freddie will tell you about a little bit more in a minute. They were both two of the earliest lay preachers in the Methodist Church that were black. Absalom Jones was born as a slave in Delaware in 1746. He moved to Philadelphia. The person that his owner at the time, I hate saying that phrase. I just hate saying that. Person who was allowed him to get an education. He worked side jobs so that he could free his wife, because in America, children were whatever the mother was is what the children were. So in order to free his children, he paid money to free his wife. Eventually, he was able to earn his freedom through his words for himself. Again, he was licensed to preach at St. George Methodist Episcopal Church, but that church was still segregated. So he was allowed to preach to blacks, but he and his friends had to sit up in the balcony. And when he brought that to their attention, they didn't seem to listen. Not didn't seem to listen, they didn't listen. And Absalom Jones balked at the idea that he was anything less than all the other people in the other pews as a child of God. He and Allen, again, who Freddie's going to tell you more about in a minute, formed a group called the Free African Society that worked to help recently freed slaves and also petition the government for causes for Black Americans. Eventually, he was able to convince the bishop of Pennsylvania at the time, in Philadelphia, to form the first Black church, St. Thomas Episcopal Church, that's still there today in Philadelphia. He organized the church in 1794. At their first meeting, they unanimously voted him as their pastor. He was ordained a priest in 1802. He was active in civic government. He spoke before Congress. And he baptized, I want you to hear this number because this is important to me. He baptized 1,250 Black men, women, and children into the church. 1,250. He had this bustling church. But yet, when they asked to be treated like all the other churches and seated at diocesan convention and have voice and vote, they were told no. In fact, the white delegates at that convention asked them not to interfere in diocesan governance. I have some of his sermon that I'd like to share in a minute, but what I want to point to is Absalom Jones tried to change the Episcopal Church from the inside. He tried to form and lift up Black leadership to have a voice, but he was never treated like the white priests. And I'm going to tell more about his story and what happened in the church after that, but I want Freddie to tell you a little bit about his good friend. Freddie, over to you.
Well, thank you, Michael. First, I want to say, in our tradition, we always say, "The Lord be with you," and you say,
"And also with you."
So we're more alike than what we really know. And again, I want to thank my friend Michael for doing this. At this time in our nation, we need more dialogue. We need more togetherness than we do separation. In America, we often say, don't talk about race, religion, and politics, but those are the things that divide us. And I know you have questions for me, as I have questions for you, but we are sometimes afraid to ask these questions because of what we feel we may perceive to be. If I ask you a certain question, am I a racist or do I have tendencies? So we need to not be afraid to do that. But to the task at hand, I can't tell the story of Richard Allen without interwoven it with Absalom Jones, because the two of them and others started this walk together. But Absalom Jones had a love and an affinity for the Episcopal Church. But so first off, Richard Allen, he bought his freedom in 1780. And by buying his freedom, he was able to change his name. He was legally named Negro Richard. So he changed his name from Negro Richard to Richard Allen. And the thing about the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, it was the first independent Protestant denomination that was founded by Black people, but it was not founded on a theological basis. It was actually founded on a racial ideology. The AME Church grew out of what was called the Free African Society. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones founded this together in Philadelphia in 1787. Allen was a deacon in the Methodist Episcopal Church, and him along with Absalom Jones were members of St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church. But because of the evangelistic ministry of Allen and Jones, the members, the Black congregants of St. George's Church began to grow by leaps and bounds. At one time, they were having different services because of the numbers of people that were there. But the white congregants of St. George's were upset and frustrated because so many Black people were finding the Lord. Think about that. You have a church who say they believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, but they're mad because too many Black people are finding the Lord. They wanted to keep that blonde, blue-eyed Jesus strictly for themselves. And so they begin to segregate the members of St. George's Methodist Church, and they forced the Black congregants to the balcony. And they did not want them praying at the altar when the whites were praying at the altar. And so Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, and others forced their hand. They knew they were gonna get trouble when they knelt to pray, but they did it anyway. And during the prayers, the trustees of this church tried to force them from the altar. And they made the famous statement, "Let us finish our prayers, we'll leave and we'll trouble you no more." But they were not allowed to leave. They were not allowed to finish their prayers. They were pulled from their knees and forced away, and they walked out of the church. And so the members of St. George and the whole denomination did not want them in their church, but then they actively tried to block them from starting their own church. You don't want me, but you don't want me to have anything away from you. The whole dynamic is evil of itself. So they started, with the help of some Episcopalians and some Quakers, they started the Free African Society. Now, Richard Allen, although he wanted the help of the Quakers, he did not want this new denomination to move into the path that the Quakers took. He was more comfortable with the Methodist way of doing business. Absalom Jones was being pulled back to his roots in the Episcopal Church. So he eventually left. And so Richard Allen then started the Free African Society, which evolved into the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. But I think we need to remember that they did not start the African Methodist Episcopal Church for Black people. they started it for all people who wanted to worship freely. And our name in of itself may make most people believe or think that it's strictly for people of African descent. But we have a very diverse church. In fact, right here in the Pensacola, Panama City district, we have a white female pastor here locally. We have members of all races in our church. In my tenure at Allen Chapel, which is almost 8 years now, we've had Hispanic and white and other this thing races of people. Anyway, you know what I mean. We have had other people of different ethnic backgrounds to join our church. And so we've now evolved into a church in over 40 different countries all over the world. In India, we took in 4 churches in 2004. And at our last general conference, the presiding elder of the India district, which happens to be a woman, reported over 160 AME churches in India. We're in Cuba, we're in Puerto Rico, we're in England, we're in France, we're in Canada, we're in South America. In fact, there are people who look just like me who are AMEs in Canada, but they only speak French. They don't speak English. We are a diverse denomination. And when I went to the 200th the 200th celebration of our denomination in 2016, to see all of these people, black, white, brown, yellow, and red, who speak a multitude of languages come together, it blew me away. I mean, it was like a UN assembly. They had to have an earpiece on so that they could hear in their own language the translation of what was going on. So we are diverse, over 40 countries. Now we have 138 bishops. In fact, in over 204 years, we've only elected a grand total of 138 bishops. Richard Allen was bishop number 1, and we've only had 137 after him. We have 20 active bishops now as we speak. And our bishop of the 11th Episcopal District, which comprises the Commonwealth of the Bahamas and the state of Florida, is Bishop Adam Jefferson Richardson Jr., and he happens to be the senior bishop of our church. So we're diverse, we are for everybody, but as Michael said, 11 o'clock is the most segregated hour in America. It's the one place that if you have your predilections and your preconceived notions and ideas, you can retreat to a comfortable place and worship a God who is not white, and worship a God who's not black, and worship a God who looks like all of us. This song says, red and yellow, black and white, all are precious in his sight. But the fundamental question is, are we precious in each other's sight? So that's a little bit about the AME Church, the African and again, our name, Africa, the Free African Society. Methodist, Richard Allen wanted to maintain the Methodist way. And Episcopal is our form of government. Many years ago, when V. Eugene Robinson was ordained a bishop, the first openly gay bishop, we had a lot of questions. Is this guy part of you all's church? No, that's a different denomination. Look how far we've come in these number of years, but look how far we still have to go.
So
back to Michael.
You make a great point. The AME Church is not a solely black church, but what was unique about it when Richard Allen formed it was it gave leadership and was organized by Black Americans and gave them equal voice to anybody else. And imagine how that must have felt in a world where they didn't have equal voice anywhere. But yet in their church, they did.
Well,
Absalom Jones, go ahead.
And I need to make another point here too, is that every major Black denomination in America was birthed out of the AME church. The AME Zion, the CME, Missionary Baptist, all of them in one way or another was birthed out of the AME church. And the Church of God in Christ was birthed from the AME church, and the Church of God in Christ, a Black bishop in that church ordained the first ministers in the Assemblies of God. And so by genetics or whatever, you can draw a line, however crooked it may look, from the AME church to every major Black denomination in America.
Yeah, so I want to read a little. Actually, I'm not going to read much of it. I would love to. Absalom Jones preached this sermon, and it was the date. It was on January 1st, which was when they outlawed the slave trade, not slavery, the slave trade, and he called it Thanksgiving Day. He said that was like our Thanksgiving Day, and he quotes from Exodus where it says that God heard the cry of the Jewish people, and then God came down. And he starts this sermon with this list of things that God heard. He heard when families were split up. He heard when people were whipped. He heard when they were put on boats and caused wars and all these things. And God heard that. And then he says, and God came down. And God came down when Congress passed this law. And God came down when these things, when our white brothers and sisters stood up with us on this issue. And God came down and is acting through us. And then he ends it with this. Let the history of the sufferings of our brethren and of their deliverance descend by this means to our children, to the remotest generations, and when they shall ask in a time to come, saying, what means the lessons and the psalms, the prayers and the praises and the worship of this day? Let us answer them by saying, the Lord on the day of which this is the anniversary, abolished the trade which dragged your fathers from their native country and sold them as bondsmen in the United States of America. In other words, what he's saying is, I hope they're going to remember that God did this. It might be people voting, but God did this. Now, I want to fast forward. So AME, so basically you have these two roads that these two men took with great respect for each other. Richard Allen formed a denomination with Black leadership and a value of the Black voice. Absalom Jones tried to do that from within the inside of the Episcopal Church. So let's fast forward. By 1930, only 1% of Blacks in America are Episcopal. There are only 1% of all Blacks would be called Episcopalians. When I told you earlier that Absalom Jones baptized 1,250 Black men and women in that one church. So what happened in between there? Well, after the Civil War, when the Union and the Confederacy came back together, the Episcopal Church had to figure that out. They had been divided for a short period of time. There was a Confederate Episcopal Church. But as they came together, they had to figure out what it meant to have now freed Black Episcopalians in the South. And some churches, like for example, the church in Pawleys Island, South Carolina, on their rolls, they were half Black. Half of the communicants that came to church every Sunday at the end of before the Civil War were Black. Over time, though, there was a great exodus of Blacks from the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church was more concerned with welcoming back the Confederate Church than they are with what to do with freed Black Episcopalians. If you look at the conventions, the general conventions, the next three that happen after the Civil War, they're all dealing with this issue of how can we get the North and the South back together. and very little concerned about now freed Black voices. And people started to leave. They felt their voice wasn't being heard. They didn't feel like they were equal, because the truth was they weren't. In the Southern Church especially, Black Episcopalians still couldn't vote for vestry. They couldn't be priests. They had no real voice. But strangely, the white church didn't want them to leave. They wanted them to stay, but in the role that they were comfortable with them staying. To use a metaphor from the story of Richard Allen, they wanted them to stay, but stay up in the balcony. In fact, what you hear is all these bishops and priests lamenting in their letters, sermons, and addresses to diocesan and general convention, lamenting how Blacks were leaving the Episcopal Church, but in no way realizing that it had something to do with the fact that they didn't treat them as fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. So, for example, there was a lot of efforts to do outreach, to do works of charity amongst freed Blacks. So we can start a school, and we can help with feeding programs, but as long as it's in that sort of paternalistic approach. I'm looking up, just a second. So traditionally, Black churches during this time would ask for acceptance. So there were churches then that got formed, the Episcopal churches in the South, and they would ask to be treated as parishes. And over again, they were told no. After one general convention in South Carolina, there was 500 active Black Episcopalians at a church that just asked to be seated at diocesan convention, and they were told no. And they all stood up and walked out and never came back. That became sort of symbolic to what happened in the church. Even their attempts to help were not built on equality. The church created a group called the Episcopal Freedmen's Commission that was supposed to help work with freed Black people on how they can make a better life. But the secretary of that convention, Francis Wharton, wrote that the importance of that work was because Black people were an ignorant and debased race. But if whites controlled the church, they could be elevated to self-support and self-control. I want to point out again, this is the guy that's the secretary of the committee that is supposed to be helping. So now imagine you're a Black person in the church, and that's what you hear. So over and over again, they left. They left in droves. And they left to churches that already existed, like the AME church. And they left to the churches they created. For example, there's a church in South Carolina called the Reformed Episcopal Church that was created during this time. Father, to give you another example of it, I'm going to bring this now home to me personally. Y'all know I went to Swanee, many of you do. I have 3 degrees from there. It's owned by the Episcopal Church. There was a convention in 1883, and there was talk about whether or not there should be Black bishops that were over Black men and women. And Swanee at the convention had all of the Southern bishops there, and they voted no. What they wanted instead was to have a special missionary program within the church. No power. There was only one bishop that opposed that. Interestingly, it was Bishop Wilmer, who Wilmer Hall is named after. But he didn't oppose it for good reasons. He opposed it because he said he did not believe Blacks were capable of governing themselves. And so what the Swanee plan was then later voted down by General Convention, but it showed you how the bishops at that time were looking at this issue. How they wanted to create this church. again, they were okay if they were people, if they were in the church, but they only wanted it if they could keep them in certain roles. For example, in this time, there was a group from the church called the American Church Institute for Negroes that started a lot of colleges that are still there today. For example, St. Paul's College in Lawrenceville, Virginia, St. Augustine's School in Raleigh, North Carolina, Fort Valley High in Fort Valley, Georgia, Voorhees School in Denmark, South Carolina, St. Philip's, which is a big school in San Antonio, Texas. But the reason they were formed in their opening document says, because this was the director of this group that founded these churches, said, because many ignorant, shiftless, dishonest, and seemingly hopeless Negroes are being transformed into decency, respectability, and usefulness. That's why they thought they were doing what they did. In 1903, there was an Episcopal priest named George Bragg Jr. in Baltimore. And what he asked that they be made a denomination within the denomination, that they get kind of like the AME Church's own church. We'll have an Episcopal church within the Episcopal church that is led by Black men. At the time, it was all men, so that there is a voice. But the Southern bishops rejected it in total, because they wouldn't have control over that church. What they decided to do instead was they would elect suffragan bishops who couldn't sit at the House of Bishops, and could not preside over sacraments to white people, but would instead be suffragan bishops that only served Black congregations. Only a few did this, including, I can't see the names now on my list. The first time there was a Black bishop who could proceed over a service with white people was a bishop named John Burgess in Massachusetts in 1962. And I want to get back to Freddie in a minute, but I want to tell you all one story because it's just fantastic to me. Burgess's wife was a woman named Esther. She and two white women, Mary Peabody, who was the wife of a retired bishop of New York, and Hester Campbell, the wife of the former suffragan bishop of Los Angeles, decided to take a trip down to St. Augustine. And while they were there, they all got arrested. Now, I don't know if they went there to get arrested, but you have a Black bishop's wife and two white bishops' wives. And they went to go eat at a motel diner that was segregated, and they were kicked out. The next day, they went to a bar to have a drink together, and they were kicked out. That morning, they've gone to St. Augustine, Trinity Church, which is the old Episcopal church in St. Augustine. And they were not allowed in because that church did not allow Blacks to sit in the pews. And then they were so frustrated, they went to some other restaurant, and they were kicked out of that and arrested. So here you have on the front page of the paper, 3 Episcopal bishops' wives being arrested for trying to eat at a restaurant. But he, again, was the first Black bishop that also had oversight over white churches. I could keep going from there. If you have any questions, again, Katie, can you throw up that the screen with your email address on it? If you have questions, you can email them to Reverend Katie at catherine@christchurch.net. All right, and we have some questions about the book I mentioned earlier, and I'll throw those up there. And to conclude my part, and then I'm going to have Freddie reflect. And we could go on in the civil rights. The Episcopal Church had a large role in the civil rights, and a large role both for and against. But what happened is where Richard Allen formed a denomination with Black leadership that then grew around the world, like Freddie said. Absalom Jones tried to stay within the church, and he was never seen as an equal to the white priests. And after the Civil War, the church never responded and gave an adequate voice to the now freed Blacks in the South. And what happened is they all left. Not all. I see some of my brothers and sisters from St. Cyprian's here. Many chose to stay and form churches within it, and fight for a voice. But I think that's why our church is 90% white and 4% black. Because there was no real equality. All right, I talked for a long time. Freddie, you have any thoughts on that? You're muted. Katie or Tracy, can y'all unmute him? No, he's good. There he is.
I think I'm good now. My thoughts are, has anything changed since the Civil War as far as the attitudes? Is there a large majority of Episcopalians in 2020 that would rather receive the sacraments from a white pastor than a black pastor? Are there congregants in 2020 in the Episcopal Church that would rather have a white bishop than a black bishop? Questions like, what is Father Hoffman going to receive pushback from members of Christ Church for what he's doing now? Do you want blacks in your church today? What I reflect on, and I'm hearing the history, and I asked you this off camera before, white women in the Episcopal Church, what kind of voice did they have over the years? My good friend, she's a deacon over there, Trish, would she be able,
yeah.
Pardon?
Tricia Spencer at St. Cyprian's, yeah.
Yeah, at St. Cyprian's, would she have been allowed to preside over that church in these times? So what we are going through, this struggle we're having in America with ourselves, we like to say we've made a lot of progress, but have we? And again, my friend Michael Hoffman, what do the membership of Christ's Episcopal Church really think in the privacy of their homes of what he's doing? And so that's my struggle. The comments that were made, about shiftless Negroes. And what you have to remember about me is that I drank from colored water fountains. I've been in establishments that had 3 restrooms: white men, white women, and colored. So that's my history. So that's where I stand. That's where I am. I'm in my 30 years in the United States Marine Corps, I experienced racism from without and from within. I can fight for America, but does America want to fight for me? So I have these back and forth feelings about things, and it's a struggle, Michael. It's tiresome. When I went down at the graffiti bridge when the first protest started a few days after the death of George Floyd, I came home and I stood in the middle of my bedroom and my wife was looking at me and I just broke down and I cried. It's like all these years just began to pour out of me, and I'm probably not even addressing what you asked.
Go on, preach it.
But the hurt just poured out of me, and I was just so exhausted to the point that my children and my wife were worried about me emotionally. Here we are again. So even as I'm speaking now, I can feel the years welling up inside of me. So I guess I went around the corner to go next door to what you were saying, but that's kind of where I am now.
Well, you asked a good question. How's the Episcopal Church responded since then? So, one of my seminary professors said that, as we talked about at a video that we made together, Freddie, one of the groups that Martin Luther King was addressing was the Episcopal Church. And at some point they heard that. And he said, we've been trying to live with that ever since. So, we have black bishops. We have our presiding bishop, the most powerful man in the Episcopal Church is a black man who is a strong advocate for issues of race. But here's a quick question somebody asked that I'd like to pass to you.
Okay.
How do we desegregate the churches? And maybe we shouldn't, but how do we do that? I don't think we want to say, all right, well, your church needs to stop being a church and come over to my church, or my church needs to stop being a church and go over to your church, or other black and white churches back and forth. But how do we work to desegregate the churches?
There's a scripture that says the hills are white with the harvest, but this very wise Jewish teacher said the hills are white with the harvest. Pray the Lord of the harvest, he'll send more workers. So this wise Jewish prophet was telling us that we need to go out and evangelize. This wise Jewish prophet was saying that there are people out there that need what we have. And there are people of color who need the Episcopalian method or way of doing things. There are people of color and not of color. I don't know how you say that. How can you be not of color? But there are people of all colors, black and white. There are white people that need the AME way of doing things. So I think how we desegregate this is that we have to evangelize more. I may not get this right, but Bishop G.E. Patterson of the Church of God in Christ said the ministry that the thumb is evangelism because it can touch all other areas. The second finger is the ring finger, meaning the pastor is married to the church. The pointing finger is the prophet, thou shalt not. But then he said the little finger is teaching because there's so little of it. So if the denomination were to teach more and evangelize more, there are people out there that look like me that may need the Episcopalian way of doing things. There are people that look like you that may need the AME way of doing things. And also, if you're going to invite me to your home, I can't come in with preconditions. I can only sit on this chair. I can only eat from this plate. I must come in and feel like that you truly want me in your home. If I feel any other way, I'll smile and I'll stay the appropriate amount of time. But when I leave, I won't come back. So you must be welcoming. I must feel and know that I am an equal. I must know and feel that my opinion matters. I must know and feel that I'm valued by you, that I'm not a token to prop up, to say, see, we have one. So if all these conditions are met, then the ground becomes good ground that seed can grow. But if these conditions are not there, it becomes rocky ground. And the seed may pop up, but it'll wither away. And if that seed leaves, it will never return.
Yeah, I think it's about how we grow from here on. The history is what the history is, right? And we can own it, repent of things that need to change, try to be different, but we build it from here. I don't think we can tomorrow radically change the racial makeup of the different denominations.
No.
But I do think if you're right, how are we welcoming in a real sense to anybody who might find Jesus in our congregation, regardless of race.
Well, Michael, and I've been clicking back and forth, and I've been looking at these beautiful people, and I'm pretty sure most of them are from your church. I got some really good-looking people at my church as well. But just the very fact that they're on here and they're listening, I think that's a beautiful thing. We need more dialogue, and you and I have learned a lot from each other in what I consider a short amount of time that we've known each other. So we need more dialogue. You need to preach from my pulpit. I need to preach from your pulpit. Your people need to come visit our people. Our people need to come and visit your people. It's only by us getting to know each other that we can drop these walls, these artificial walls that are paper thin that really mean nothing. That's how we do it. We do it one step at a time. And I'm gonna tell you, we don't need to forget our history. It was what it was. It's a part of who we are. It has shaped us. We can't forget where we come from, and we can't forget how we got here, but we can certainly be better and do better moving forward.
Absolutely. All right, I have another question. So you said that you hope that I don't get pushback. So this is the question. I didn't bring this up. From the church. And by the way, everybody in the church has fully been kind to me in this. I'm not done anything really brave or whatever. I'm just want to talk about how we can love each other and fix things to make it better. But they said, would you get pushback from your congregation for working with white congregations, or that you would get pushback for kind of distrust for how you might stand up?
I did get pushback. In fact, the question was asked by someone, why does he need to be with those white folk over there? And my reply was, I'm gonna do what I'm gonna do.
That's why I like you, Freddie.
And no one frightens me. I'm not worried about that. But what I did is I showed them that there is a benefit to us coming together. Number one, God made us all. And if you put all of us together, we look like God. So we're all his children. Number two, if I need a blood transfusion, I have no clue who it came from. Gender, ethnicity, denomination. And number three, there were a great number of progressive, loving people at Allen Chapel who basically shouted down the one or two negative voices. And I'm thankful for those negative voices. I thank God for people who gave me pushback, because it caused me to bend my knees a little more. And so those same persons, I can think of one or two specifically, are now on board, I guess you could say, because there's value in our unity. We can do things, the 7 or 8 churches that band together, the leaders, the pastors, we can do more together than we can separated. And they see that now. Yeah. And so, I've gotten pushback, but I understand the pushback because they were fearful, they were mistrusted. You got to understand, a lot of the people of Allen grew up like I did here in Pensacola and saw the hateful things that went on. And so there's some mistrust. But since I'm the pastor and I'm out front, I get the spears before they do.
Well, that never happened to my church, man.
Pardon?
I said that never happened to my church. That's a joke.
Dude, I know you never get pushback at Christ Church. They are 100% on board with everything you say and do.
Hey, if I move the chalice 2 inches to the right, I'll get somebody to give me an email on that.
Who moved my cheese?
Hey, Christ Church is a lovely, great. I mean, they've been nothing but kind to me and my family. They really have. And we've tried some adventurous stuff, and they've been willing to be adventurous in it. I try to do it with humility. So I want to end with this, and then I want to.
Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
A lot of your church members of Christ Church have approached me at the mall, at Walmart, and places, say, "Hey, I know you," and then they proudly say, "I'm from Christ Episcopal Church." So they have approached me publicly, and so you doing pretty well over there.
Thanks, man. So I got a final thing. So we did history. Mainly, I want to talk about that sort of divergent road. There's a million things I did not cover today in history. I mean, there's a million things. We didn't get to the civil rights, what we've done since then. We didn't get to talk. I mean, I was going to talk a little bit about the global church some more, about what it's like to be a part of a global church that has these different races in it. But I'm going to end in a minute by talking about what we're going to talk about next time. So I want to go to Freddie. Do you have anything else you want to share with the church or the people that are gathered here?
Dialogue. We need to talk more. We need to share more. And don't be afraid of how you think your question might be perceived by me. I'm a pretty good guy. And just ask my wife. I'm a pretty good guy. But I think the more we talk, the better it's going to be. So we need more dialogue. That's what I would end on.
Thank you, Freddie. Next week, so I purposely did these classes. We're in 3 of them. So first we talked about Pensacola and then the Episcopal Church. Next week, we're going to zero in on the history of Christ Church. And to tell that story, we also have to tell the history of the story of the Church of St. Cyprian's. And they are, several people from St. Cyprian's are one. I'm working out with Joy, who's going to speak, are going to kind of share some of their history, and we'll talk about ours, and what in our history we can be proud of, and what in our history is maybe something that we need to learn from and move forward from. So I know we have people on this call right now from St. Cyprian's who've joined us today, and they'll be with us next week as well. You can't tell the story of Christ Church without telling the story also of our brothers and sisters at St. Cyprian's. Freddie, I'm so grateful for you. I'm grateful for your friendship and your wisdom in this time. You're somebody that I trust and somebody I love, and I'm really thankful that you came on and joined us here today.
It's been a blessing for me as well. Thank you so much.
All right, Katie, did you have some resources to throw up that people can read if they want to at another time? If you want these and you can't write this quickly, feel free to email Reverend Katie, and she would love to send them to you. The second one is the book that I was mostly working out of today, Shattuck Gardner's Episcopalians and Race, Civil War to Civil Rights. Also, if you want a great sermon, I encourage you to read Absalon's. If you just Googled Absalom Jones Thanksgiving sermon, it'll come up, and you can read the text of it. And you can check out these books. Thank you all for joining us. This was great. Freddie was great. It's nice having you all here. There's so many of y'all we couldn't really take conversation questions, but thank you those who emailed your questions in. God bless you all. Freddie, I'll see you soon.
All right, brother. God bless you. Good night.